This is a story about fair play and justice. Or maybe it's just about how things work out. Maybe it's just about balance. Maybe it isn't even a story. Could be it's just what happened that day. I couldn't have been more than 9. I was waiting offshore in Florida Bay looking for a good place to fish. The bay was extremely shallow out that way, literally 6 inches to a foot deep, even 50 feet from the shore, and I could see there was no point in walking further out to try for deeper water. It could have been half a mile out to where it was over your knees. If I look at Google Maps today, assuming the sands haven't shifted too much since the 1960s, I can see that there is a channel far out there. I don't know if I could have made it out that far. The channel is labeled Bight Channel. I didn't know about that then. The dictionary says the word bight, B-I-G-H-T, means a curve or recess in a coastline. My recollection is that is exactly what it was. A long, featureless curve of sandy mud, and it went on for miles. For a kid like me, that was a description of a boundless fishing opportunity. Of course, I knew that bonefish, one of the greatest of silver-streaking Florida game fishes, often go in really shallow water. So I thought I might get lucky. All the big fishermen go way the hell out in the bay to flat islands that are just under the surface and drift their flat-bottom boats in the wind to throw special flies to those elusive ghost fish. And then they motor on to another island if nothing is happening. I didn't have those kind of resources. I was waiting. I was on foot. I had light spinning tackle with a self-tied, yellow-headed fly, which I couldn't throw very far. I had sent off to the Heddon Company for the weighted hook and the twine and the fake yellow-dyed ostrich feathers. I should have gotten a weight with a little more heft. I had never caught a bonefish so far. But a couple mornings back, I had seen what I thought might be bonefish, their top fins breaking the surface in shallow water as they searched for food that hopefully resembled my bright yellow lure. Maybe the wadeable shallow water I was in would never be fished by real bone fishermen. Those guys might be at risk for running aground. I could have an edge. But then, for all I knew, bonefish never even came into that shallow shore, and those fins I had seen were just jacks sporting in the shallows. I was carrying a small box of lures and was thinking of switching to topwater just to avoid dragging in a load of muddy green gunk on every cast, when I stepped into a slightly deeper spot and went in over my ankle into the gray silt muck. I was wearing old tennis shoes, so that was no big deal, but I couldn't pull my foot out without losing my shoe. And I was about to reach down for the shoe when a voice called out to me from pretty far inland. "Hey, there's quicksand out there. You shouldn't be out so far." I thought I recognized the voice, and I didn't like it. But I did whoever it was the courtesy of looking at him, and indeed it was the older kid from the campground that I had heard taking harsh instruction from his father about not wrecking their truck. They had a trailer with a hitch to a smaller overland tow-along truck that I knew the kid was allowed to drive. The kid must have just got his license because his voice had that adolescent cracking sound that is only halfway to deepening. The voice pissed me off. Not because I was afraid of quicksand. I wasn't. I didn't know there was quicksand out there, if there was. But I didn't want to hear it from him, even if there was. Who told him there was quicksand out there? I figure I could handle it if there was any. And I didn't want anybody telling me what to do or not do, particularly one who had been receiving life advice from his father and now was trying to do the same for me. I particularly didn't want to receive any provisos about where or how to do my fishing. The best way to learn about fishing is to learn it the hard way. If that involves quicksand, then so be it. Plus, even back then, I didn't want to share the magnificent solitude of a place like that with anybody. "I'm okay," I yelled at the kid. I was looking forward to the day when my own high-pitched voice would change. The kid was at least 100 feet away from me, well up on the drier land, and somewhat close to the margin of mangroves that marked the very high water mark. Although around there, dry land is no more than about a foot higher than wet land. The kid couldn't stop himself from further sharing his analysis of my situation. "There's no fish out there. Too shallow," he yelled. Now this was too much, and I looked at the kid close enough to see that he was supplied with no fewer than 3 rods, was overdressed in some kind of all-weather camo, and was apparently going to shore fish with a tackle box that was big enough that it should have had its own pull cart. Plus, besides, if there were no fish out there, then what the hell was he doing out there? I thought that he must have been told that there was some kind of pool or channel ahead where the water was deeper and there might be good fishing. Could be bonefish in the shallows along the edge of that. I also figured that he must have driven the little overland truck on some sandy road beyond the mangrove edge and then just browsed out of the bushes, whereas I had already fished my way over a mile to the current no-fish address. I yelled back, "Okay, thanks." I assume he shrugged at that. I would have. And I set back to slowly trying to work my shoe out of the muck, which I did. And I swished it clean in the light waves. The problem now was putting it back on without setting my reel down in the salt water. I realized I was going to have to wade inshore to get the shoe back on, which I started to do. You could definitely slice your feet up out there without shoes. But that was going to let the kid up on the shore have the pleasure of seeing me heed his warning about the quicksand out there and no fish. I was in the Steve McQueen camp on that sort of thing, like in the movie Tom Horn, where he won't defend himself even though he's innocent. "I didn't want to give him the satisfaction," he says, and hangs. If this kid yells, "Good, that's much safer," or "Glad I was able to save you," then I was going to say nothing. I had to get my shoe back on, and I waded on in. I think that movie came out in the 80s, by the way, so I couldn't have been thinking of that exact line back when I was wading along the Bight, but that was the gist of it. When I got to dry land, I glanced up toward the kid in the hopes that he had moved on down the shore while I was coming in. Bafflingly, there he was, still in more or less the same place, and he was waving his arms like he was crossing a ditch on a narrow, bouncing 1x6 plank. I then thought he might be some kind of crazy kid with some kind of mental problem, and I felt bad about some of my previous judgments. I also felt a real imposition on the horizon that might well ruin a perfectly good day of fishing. As I got onto dry land, I could see he was really flailing in the air, and then he bent down and was doing something with his hands. Yellow jackets? Maybe ants. Maybe ants ran out of a log up his clothes. That happened to me once. He wasn't yelling or anything. And then I realized I could only see the top half of him. From the waist up, he had the same height as the mangrove brush margin beyond him in the distance. The kid was sunk in the ground. I put down my tackle and got my shoe on and walked. I didn't run. I didn't want to run up toward him. He was thrashing around in what could only be a proverbial quicksand pit. His fishing rods were lying beside him, and his tackle box had been cartwheeled off to the side. I don't know at what age a child is capable of understanding irony, but I can tell you, in my case, at age 9, it preceded the age of my understanding of true empathetic danger to a fellow human being. I didn't think it was funny exactly, but I did think it was philosophically instructive. I also really didn't see how there could be some kind of quicksand mud hole up there on the dry land, like in some kind of Tarzan movie, that was going to suck down an entire high 5.5-foot kid. Surely he would hit bottom soon, if he hadn't already. And yet, as I got closer, he sunk another half a foot over his belt line and really started swinging his arms wildly. He still wasn't yelling. I would have been yelling. Am I really going to see this kid disappear? If so, the thought crossed my mind that I might just not mention it to anybody. Who's to say I wouldn't somehow get blamed for it? I'm going to say it crossed my mind. I'm not going to say I would have acted on it. At that point, I just stopped and waited to see what he was going to do. He was crying pretty bad and obviously panicked. I could see that. That scared me a little. Then I realized he didn't actually know I was there. He was half out of his mind. I actually said, "Stop struggling. It only makes it worse." I remember saying that exactly. How I knew to say that must have come from the very same aforementioned Tarzan movie, or maybe some Hardy Boy books I had read, maybe Treasure Island. The kid did, in fact, stop struggling and looked at me. Not with the hatred that I expected, but more of surprise. He hadn't been tracking my approach. Then he seemed to change to a look more of kid-to-kid companionship. This was actually some sort of adventure, some kind of fun. I thought, in spite of the age difference, this is not such a bad kid at all. This is some kind of ridiculous situation thoughtless kids like ourselves get into all the time. We're in this together. We're equals. Either he or he and I together, we're going to figure a way to get him out of there. I had to admire that. He was older, more thoughtful. It's better to be an older kid than a younger kid. Still, I figured the most likely resolution was I was going to have to go for help. And there was going to be some kind of police or ranger action involving ropes and a pickup with spinning tires pulling him out like a horse out of a pig wallow. I looked around. The sand which he was sunk in looked no different than any other sand around there. Nobody would have known it was quicksand, including me. Maybe, if you looked with hindsight, there was an area that looked a little suspicious. Another thing I knew was that I was not going to get close enough for him to grab me. I learned that in detail when I was later trained to be a lifeguard at a lake in college. But I already knew that the person you're trying to save is the very one that will drown both of you if you don't watch yourself. Even if I still didn't accept that it was possible for the pit he was in to be deep enough to actually suck him down completely, I just thought he was really, no kidding, stuck. After he had stopped struggling, he had, in fact, stopped going down. Sure would be handy if there was an ordinary piece of rope around, I thought, which there would have been if I'd have had a boat, but I was a shore fisherman. They don't carry much. I don't remember much further conversation. So far, the kid hadn't said a thing. I don't know if that was out of embarrassment at the fateful turning of the tables or what. I thought there was an outside chance the kid was a mute, and that cracking voice that had warned me earlier was a different kid who I hadn't seen, who had already walked on or gone for help or sunk into his own mud hole so that no sound could escape into the pleasant South Florida air. I said, "I'll get a branch." The kid nodded. We both knew that a good solid tree branch would keep him from going deeper because it would lie flat across the surface and distribute the downward force, and he might even be able to brace himself and crawl up on it and crocodile his way out of there. I ran for the mangrove edge. If you go into the woods up into the foothills of the Smokies, where we lived when we weren't down in the Glades camping, you would find a fair-sized dead branch lying on the ground in no time. Not so in a Florida mangrove swamp 30 years after it was flattened by the big 1935 hurricane. Every dead thing was weathered hard as rock and smooth and solid like ivory that was still attached to the dead elephant. And the new growth was thin and wiry and impossible to break off. I ran around in circles for a while and did that until I was afraid the kid would think I had run off. Although he should have known I never would have left my fishing tackle down there. I started to go back and discuss matters further when I tripped over what turned out to be an extremely weathered piece of sailcloth. It must have washed up on some super high tide. That would do it. I could either steady him with it or he could roll it up on the treacherous surface. He might even be able to struggle up on it and pull his legs free. I could drag it back to the kid. But I couldn't pry the ancient canvas out of the weeds and sand. I tried to scratch it loose with my fingers, but it was too buried in. I gave up and headed back to the kid. If you want to know how freely kids can think, the thought briefly crossed my mind that I could ask the kid himself to come and help me unbury it. When you get older, you can't have that kind of thought. It gets cut off by the logical constraints that all your thoughts swirl around in. Some would say, if you really want to think free, that's not actually a good thing. When I got back, the kid had made considerable progress getting out of the hole on his own. He had used one of his rods to snag his tackle box and drag it towards him, and then he put his rod handles on top and was elbowing his way outward on top of them. The box was sinking, but supplying enough purchase so that he already had one leg about half out of the muck. It wasn't easy, but he kept wiggling back and forth, gaining a millimeter at a time. I just watched. I had the feeling he didn't want me interfering with him any more than I had wanted him interfering when he interrupted me wading along the Bight in the first place. Once he got a knee out, things went quickly and he rolled over onto firmer sand that looked exactly like the rest of the beach that was not dangerous. Quicksand. Tricky stuff. The kid stood up and scraped some of the mud off his pants and then seemed to realize that he was standing on a dry beach with a little kid looking at him. He looked at me and he actually said, "Thanks." That kid was okay. It was like we were all square. I had been a part of it. He had been a part of it. Adventure closed. He picked up his stuff and walked to the mangroves near where I had found the sailcloth and walked in like he knew some kind of overland shortcut, presumably back to his truck. I walked back down to the water's edge and picked up my rod and continued my wading. I wish I could tell you that later that day I found a fishing nirvana, but in fact it was hot as hell and my shoes kept getting heavy with mud and it looked like that shallow shore went on forever, and so after an hour or so I turned back. I stuck to wading in the shallow water on the return trip. It seemed to me that the sand was firmer down there where it was wetter, denser, more stable, less likely to turn into quicksand down there, if you ask me. And going back the way I had already tested was, in fact, comforting. That was my advice to myself. Stick to that. No quicksand down there in the shallow water. No fish either.